Long ago, before this day's confusion did begin, throughout the stars did we go wandering. Distance was no barrier, and time it had no hope. Free to come and free to go. Free to come and free to go. Open up the book of stars. Open up the
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Karmic Evolution's Astrologically Speaking podcast. I'm your host, SHERI HASAN of Karmic Evolution Astrology, and I'm coming to you on March 1st, 2024 from karmicevolution.com or any of your favorite podcast stations. And before we get into this week's astro news you can use, my usual quick reminder that the show aims to bring you the truth about astrology and your soul's karmic evolution, and that a new show drops every Friday at 11 a.m. Pacific and 2 p.m. Eastern on most major podcast platforms, including my website at karmicevolution.com. So, the other order of business that I like to announce at the beginning of my shows is that I am offering a 75-minute Karmic Evolution Natal Insight reading for only $125, a discounted rate, which is for podcast listeners only. So if you want to learn more about the true meaning of your individual birth chart, and you'd like to gain greater consciousness about your soul's true mission and purpose in this lifetime, and what may be holding you back now from achieving it, then this is a reading for you. If you feel stuck or frustrated or otherwise stymied in your particular areas of interest, could be relationships, career, finances, health, then this reading is for you. If you'd like to understand how, by letting your unconscious script, which is based on what I call old soul conditioned behaviors and habits from the past, run the show, and now you want to become more conscious about how to change this script going forward, then this reading is for you. And if you'd like to co-create your own future happiness through astrological insight, then this reading is definitely for you. As I like to say, conscious awareness has never been so easy or so affordable when you take advantage of this special discounted offer for my Karmic Evolution Natal Insight reading at karmicevolution.com/karmic125. Now, I would like to say that it's important to bear in mind that your birth chart is like a soul map for your own personal hero's journey. And so this reading looks at that soul map and that hero's journey to date, which is based a lot on early childhood, potential past life karma, and what brought you to the habits and unconscious scripts that run the show now. And you're looking again to become more conscious about that so you can change it up. So the reading is not one of transits and progressions, because the transits and progressions are what happen as we age and grow in wisdom and consciousness. We need to, in other words, understand the natal chart and our particular thematic journey in this lifetime, which is often not what people think it is, believe it or not. It depends on how, conscious you are. Some people go through a lot of awakenings early in life, and others much later, and others never. My personal one was midlife. So, to each his own, right? We all have our own individual journeys. But my point is that it's only when you understand the basic layout and the soul map of your individual birth chart that you can then understand what the universe is asking of you through transits and progressions. If, like a lot of astrologers do, you're only concerned with the present and really do not care about the past and what brought you to this particular point of time where there might be a crisis or an adjustment that needs to be made, through many different things, job loss, health issue, death of a loved one, divorce, all that kind of stuff, we need to look back before we can look forward. So that is what this reading that I am offering at a discount is about. So again, you can find my Karmic Evolution Natal Insight discounted offer at karmicevolution.com / karmic 125. And the second announcement I'd like to reiterate from last week is that I will be leading a class, an 8-week class starting March 10th and running through April 28th from noon to 2 p.m. called Aspects in Chart Delineation Part 2. Now, I gave the Part 1 last fall, and I want to say that if you have a basic knowledge of the meaning of the planets, signs, and houses, and you have a basic knowledge of some of the Ptolemaic aspects, the conjunction, the sextile, the square, the trine, and the opposition, this is a continuation of that, as well as getting into some of the lesser known or more minor aspects that we can find in a chart, such as the quincunx and the yod formation, the grand cross and the grand trine, and other things that you might not even be aware of exist, and what they mean in terms of the chart as a whole. So if you're interested in that, I would urge you to check it out, because we will be looking at all those things, semi-squares, also semi-sextiles, stuff like that, to explore how we can apply the meaning of these aspects to an individual's life. And we do that by looking at example charts, not necessarily of class students, but of those people who are prominent, people we all know, whether they're historical figures from the past or they are in the limelight in some way or another now. And sometimes, we look at charts of people who passed, but their charts come into prominence again based on collective events. So if you'd like to understand the general meaning of aspects, both major and minor, and how they might manifest differently, even in a natal chart, the same aspects can manifest differently in different people's charts. So we go into all of that, and it's basically a chart delineation class that uses the learning about, or further learning about, how aspects manifest and how they've manifested specifically in certain people's charts. Or we might even look at a country or something like that, especially with so much going on in the world now. And if you're a listener or a regular listener to this podcast, you know that that's a special interest of mine. But again, to remind everyone, I am an archetypal, psychological, and evolutionary astrologer. I've been practicing professionally since 2008. And if you would like to expand your astrological knowledge by studying with me, then by all means, to sign up for this class or to learn more about it, please go to aspnj.org. The class is being held under the auspices of the Astrological Society of Princeton. That's the ASP, which is in New Jersey, which is the nj.org. And by all means, feel free to email me at SHERI@KARMICEvolution.com if you have any questions about concerns about the class. And if not, I hope to see you on March 10th. All right. So now let's get into this week's astro news you can use. I'd like to begin today's podcast by looking at the bigger astrological picture before we get into the nitty-gritty of what's happening right now. And that's simply to present a wider narrative of longer-lasting astrological energies as they affect us before we look at the microcosm of specific current happenings, in order to provide not only a myopic short-term picture, but also not just a general long-term one, but rather one that integrates both for a wider sense of overall contextual understanding. Now, many of you who listen to the show regularly will know that we're going to be approaching our third quarter square, which I'll talk about more towards the end of the show. But what I'd like to revisit and then talk about a little more anew right now is the nature of the current Saturn-Pluto cycle in Capricorn, which began on January 12th of 2020, something that I've devoted a couple of past podcasts to, so I'm not going to go into major detail about it. But I want to add to that discussion the currently waning Saturn to Neptune in Pisces synodic cycle, which is currently in its balsamic or ending phase before Neptune enters Aries on March 31st of 2025, so about a year from now, right? A year and a month, 13 months. And when Saturn enters Aries on May 25th of 2025, and they meet to start or conjoin to start a new cycle on February 20th of 2026. All right, now that's a long ways away, but the point is, again, for me to try to introduce you to the bigger picture. So the Saturn-Pluto cycle, which again, as I noted, I've discussed in much greater detail in past podcasts, really relates to the development of a new world order during its 36-year cycle. The most recent cycle began in Capricorn on January 12, 2020, as noted, and the one before that was in Libra at the end of 1982 and the beginning of 1983, and the one before that began in 1947 in Leo, which was the time when America became a dominant power, or shall I say the king, in the new post-World War II international order. Now, the Saturn-Neptune cycle, however, correlates with more with the new ideological ideas that emerge from the collective, more of a collective unconscious energy. Saturn, Pluto is always about transformation, death and rebirth, and reform. Rob Hand, one of the renowned astrologers who I often quote from his books, Planets in Transit, and he's written many, many other books. He talks about Pluto as the collective planet of social reform, right? Whereas Neptune is the collective planet of the collective unconscious. And as we know, Neptune is the ruler of Pisces, and the 12th house in the natural chart has a lot to do with projection, right? So images or ideas or chaos, from chaos comes clarity, right? So I wanted to read to you, this is because we're in the balsamic phase, or the ending of the last cycle of the Saturn-Neptune conjunction, right? We are, this is how the website cyclesofhistory.com defines the Saturn-Neptune cycle, synodic cycle in general. So they say, what does the cycle mean? Well, we have given the generic meaning of this cycle as the implementation or restriction of collective ideals. In other words, converting ideals into practice or preventing ideals from becoming reality. Whereas the Neptune-Pluto cycle signifies how collective whereas the Neptune-Pluto cycle signifies how collective idealism in the form of religion, philosophy, and long-term societal goals becomes completely transformed, and whereas the Uranus-Neptune cycle signifies how innovative, intellectual, technological, or aesthetic ideas get taken up as ideals, the Saturn-Neptune cycle deals with how ideals which have been created, written about, voiced, discussed, or debated start getting actually adopted or put into practice, or are prevented from that happening. And so I just want to interject here because we'll bear in mind that we're in the process of entering Pluto, or Pluto's entrance into Aquarius for the next 20 years, come the middle or to end at November 19th of 2024. So we're at the balsamic phase of that cycle too, which began with Pluto and Capricorn in November of 2008, right? And that when we talk about things like technology and innovative intellectual ideals, we've got that going on, that ending and a new cycle beginning, as Pluto has been retrograding back and forth last year and this year between Aquarius and Capricorn, right? So we know that we know that things are changing. We're moving out of one period and into another. However, the Cycles of History website continues. In the Saturn-Uranus cycle, we looked at how a new mindset sweeps away the status quo. Saturn and Uranus together, particularly in the square periods or the oppositional periods of that cycle, will represent often rebellion, breaking away, wanting something new, needing freedom. So that this says in this cycle, we look at how ideals become the status quo. So here we shall be looking at the conjunction for clear indications that new societal ideals make their first start to becoming accepted as the norm. Throughout history, this conjunction would not so much coincide, therefore, with the beginning of restructuring, overthrow, and later dissolution of the established order, but with the early manifestation, the struggle to get adopted, and the widespread acceptance of new ideals or ideologies. And that's the end of the quote from that website. So I'm saying when we combine the early waxing portion of the current Saturn-Pluto in Capricorn cycle with the current closing, now balsamic, which means, balsamic is like, you may have heard that term in relationship to the monthly lunar cycles, right? When the moon starts to disappear from sight right before we have a new moon, it's in its balsamic phase, which is known as the dark of the moon. And if we extend that to other synodic cycles between planets other than the moon, we can feel, you have to feel your way. It's a very, very intuitive time, right? Assuming one is paying attention, but it can also cause, particularly with this cycle in Pisces of Saturn to Neptune, a lot of confusion. So we're beginning to see how we're in the nascent stages of a new world order as we're watching the ending of another cycle based on old ideologies beginning to come to an end. So I just want to mention the last balsamic stages of the 36-year cycle of Saturn to Neptune was the last, well, not balsamic, but the last third quarter square, which of course is, a quarter of the way till the end of that cycle. And if it's a 36-year cycle, we can break it up into 9 years. So it wasn't quite yet balsamic until it reached, maybe 2 years before the end. But they last met exact in a square on March 3rd of 1989 at 11 degrees and 53 minutes of Capricorn. Now, if we again break the 36-year synodic cycle of Saturn to Neptune into quarters, we get that every 9 years, as I just said, after the conjunction, Saturn will make its first waxing square to Neptune. Then 9 years later, it'll oppose it. And then 9 years later, it'll form the waning square or the third quarter square until they meet again in a new sign when the 36-year cycle ends. So for that cycle begun in 89, the waxing square occurred in 1998. The opposition around, and it's not exact because the, planets retrograde and the slower moving planets like Neptune, same thing with the Saturn-Pluto cycle, they don't adhere to Saturn's 29.5-year regular cycle because they go at different speeds, the outer planets, and they also retrograde for longer periods of time. So the waxing square again occurred in 1998, the opposition in 2007, and the waning square in 2015 and 16. So the exact dates of that last waning square, which occurred 3 times, happened on November 26th of 2015 at 7 degrees of Saturn at Sagittarius to Neptune in Pisces, June 17th, 2016, when they were square from Sag to Pisces at 12 degrees, and on September 10th of 2016, when they were both at 10 degrees, Saturn at 10 degrees Sag, and Neptune at 10 degrees Pisces. Now, you'll note that was during the last U.S. presidential election. So hold that thought. Now, some of us astrologers, particularly those of us who've studied psychological astrology, know that Jungian astrologer Liz Green has correlated the Saturn-Neptune synodic cycle, again, meaning from the time the two planets meet in the same sign until the end of that cycle, right before they meet again in the next zodiacal sign. She correlated that waning square long ago with the rise of fascism. And not only just here in the US, of course, but globally, especially since the last waning Saturn-Neptune cycle corresponded, as I just mentioned, with the election of Donald Trump as president, his introduction of the Make America Great, or again, MAGA right-wing politics, which gave rise both domestically and still is, and globally to nationalism, isolationism, and autocratic leanings. So the cycle before the one that began in 89, the last Saturn-Neptune cycle, began in 1953, and the one before that in 1927. So the one that began in 53 was, the waxing square, opposition, and waning square occurred in 1962, 1971, and 1980, respectively, before, again, the new cycle began in 89. And in 89, which began the cycle we're still currently in, we had several huge happenings that related to a new world order. For example, we had the fall of the Berlin Wall in 89, which led to the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. We had the abolition of apartheid, which took hold in 89, from 88 to 90, after 30 years of central legislation of apartheid, right? We had also the move in China to restrict people because democratic protests there led to the Tiananmen Square massacre. Okay, so there's a whole bunch of other things too we can look at if you're a history buff or if you're familiar with that. And this last cycle, which I was talking, that's the last cycle, but the one before that began in 53, we can easily see correlates with the movement from the era of McCarthyism in the U.S. Congress, or anti-communist sentiment here in America, through to the civil rights era, 1962, between 62 and 71, and in 70 through the desegregation movement of Brown versus Board of Education in 1959 to the election of JFK as president, and then 71, the desegregation, the continued efforts to desegregate, which caused the busing wars of 1971. I grew up in New York City, I remember that, through to the election of Ronald Reagan, which heralded a new ideological movement related to deregulation and government austerity, of philosophies that are still in play in some conservative GOP quarters even today, which we can see pretty obviously if we're looking at the fact that, and I mentioned this later, that the budget deficit, not budget deficit, but the new U.S. budget is now like going on 6 months past when it should have been already authorized, right? So, again, since that last quarter square of Saturn to Neptune in mutable signs, we're seeing the end of the cycle. But if we look back even further, we go back to 1927. So what happened in 1927 is that at those quarterly squares, we saw the introduction and the rise of fascism in Europe, particularly in Italy with Mussolini and in Germany with Hitler, right? So that cycle began in 27. That took us through, at least here in America too, took us through the Depression in 1929. In 1936, we had the burgeoning. We had Kristallnacht in 1939 in Austria when the Jews were driven out of Vienna and other areas. And then, of course, the opposition was in 1945 which is pretty much the height of the end of World War II, and then again the new cycle started circa 1953-54. So it seems like this cycle now, at least since the square, but probably we could track it back to, like I said, the early 50s, is, the rise of more nationalism, isolationism, etc., that's taken hold in our Congress and in our international politics. So my question now as an astrologer is, what will both Neptune's March 31st, 2025 entrance into Aries bring us, in addition to his subsequent retrograde back into Pisces circa October 22nd, 2025 through to January 27th of 2026, and what will the Saturn-Neptune conjunction in Aries bring after Saturn's entrance into Aries, as I noted before, on May 25th of 2025, for the future. And I just wanted to quote evolutionary astrologer Maurice Fernandez, because I saw that he said, quote, "The next Saturn-Neptune conjunction will occur at the 0 Aries point," which is a cardinal point, right? And he says the first degree of the zodiac, itself marking the birth of a new era. And again, we're so close to Pluto's 20-year ingress into Aquarius by the end of this year, we can see something similar. And he goes on to say the conjunction will be near exact in July 2025 and will perfect at 0 Aries on February 20th, 2026. And he asks, does this forebode a fiery birth from the ocean's womb? Well, that is something that we will talk about in greater length in future shows. But for now, what I'd like to do is just to give you some insight, because I recently took a subscription. I'm a 9th house sun, so, I love politics and international affairs. And I came across this article because I just took a subscription to a magazine called Foreign Affairs, titled "Gaza and the End of the Rules-Based Order: What the Israel-Hamas War Means for the Future of Human Rights and International Law." And that also, of course, 9th house, right? Law, higher education, religion, and foreigners, foreign travel, and what I would call, in the terminology of today's politics, immigration and issues around the freedom of movement of people over water or large swaths of land. So this article, and I'll quote from it, says, "Today's diplomatic complicity in the catastrophic human rights and humanitarian crisis in Gaza, which today it was announced has killed 30,000 Palestinians," and I continue to quote from the magazine, "is the culmination of years of erosion of the international rule of law and global human rights system. Such disintegration began in earnest after 9/11, when the United States embarked on its war on terror, a campaign that normalized the idea that everything is permissible in the pursuit of terrorists." And let's remember, too, I remember the 1970s and the formation of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, and I am not speaking pro or con. I am an American, and I remember when they assassinated the Israeli athletes in Munich in 1971, and the taking down of I forget what year it was, but also in the 70s, the airplane that killed hundreds of people, right? They had a bomb on the airplane, or suicide bomber. Anyway, so this is what led, as this article is saying, to the United States really developing when it was attacked again for the first time since Pearl Harbor in 1941 on its own soil. So he says, when the United States embarked on its war of terror, a campaign that normalized the idea that everything is permissible in the pursuit of terrorists. To prosecute its war in Gaza, Israel borrows ethos, strategy, and tactics from that framework, doing so with the support of the United States. It is as if the grave moral lessons of the Holocaust of World War II have been all but forgotten. Remember 1947, post-World War II, development of a new world order, Saturn, Pluto, right, in Leo. He says, have been all but forgotten, and with them the very core of the decades-old never again principle. Its absolute universality, the notion that it protects us all or none of us. And this sentence I found particularly profound. This disintegration, so apparent in the destruction of Gaza and the West's response to it, signals the end of the rule-based order and the start of a new era. So, this is the reason I am reading this to you, because I want everyone to see the bigger picture. Now, it continues, universality, the principle that all of us, without exception, are endowed with human rights equally, no matter who we are or where we live, lies at the heart of the international human rights system. And I will interject that it also lies at the heart of the United States Declaration of Independence, which is almost 250 years old, and that even though we've had to more clearly define who's entitled to those human rights equally, we've been making progress just slowly over the years. Women, minorities, black people, people of color, disabled people, different religions, you name it. So the article goes on, it was the foundation of the Genocide Convention and Universal Declaration of Human Rights, both adopted in 1948, and it continued to inform new means of accountability over the years, including the International Criminal Court, established in 2002. For decades, that legal infrastructure has helped ensure that states uphold their human rights obligations. It has defined human rights movements globally and underpinned the 20th century's greatest human rights achievements. A critic of this system might argue that states have only ever paid lip service to universality. The 20th century abounds with examples of failures to uphold the equal dignity of all, the violence used against those advocating for decolonization, the Vietnam War, the genocides in Cambodia and Rwanda, the wars that followed the breakup of Yugoslavia, and many more. These events all testify to an international system rooted more in systematic inequality and discrimination than in universality. With good reason, one could contend that universality was never applied to Palestinians, who, as the Palestinian-American scholar Edward Said expressed it, have been instead, since 1948, quote, the victims of the victims, the refugees of the refugees. Yet the fate of universality resides not in the hands of those who betray it. Rather, as a perennial, ambitious project for humankind, its power rests first and foremost in its continual proclamation and its persistent defense. Throughout the 20th century, the principles of universality had countless setbacks, but the overarching direction was toward proclaiming, affirming, and defending it. That shifted, however, in the early years of the 21st century with the unleashing of the War on Terror following the tragic events of 9/11. And the article concludes, the painful memories of wrongs, both recent and from long ago, can help save lives today as well as in the future in Israel, in the Palestinian territories, and beyond. That process must begin immediately, however, as time is running out. If history indeed repeats itself, as we are told it often does, then we should consider ourselves well warned. With the universal application of international law likely in its death throes, and nothing yet to take its place save brutalist national interests and sheer greed, widespread anger can be and will be exploited by the many ready to foster even broader instability on an even greater global scale. Now, I want to mention also that, and I brought this up starting almost 2 years ago when it occurred, my favorite to mention Jupiter-Neptune conjunction in Pisces, which occurred exact on April 12th of 2022. And that was for the first time in 160-something years, because the last one happened in 1856, which led up eventually to the secession of the United States southern states from the Union. In other words, the dissolution, Neptune, Pisces, of the Union, right? And the belief e pluribus unum, right? We are united we stand, divided we fall. Of our stated democratic philosophy also that all men are created equal, since obviously the Civil War was fought over slavery, and vested with the right to pursue, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? So if we look at what's happened since then, and as I pointed out on past podcasts, this conjunction really has still been playing out. It's 160 something year energy, right? I mean, yeah, it'll change, but we're still again in the fairly nascent stages of it. And these include the dissolution of our U.S. legal and judicial system, the foundation of our ideas of democracy, which is to say that no man is above the law, and our immigration policy, which has gone from welcoming the world, remember the Statue of Liberty, give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to be free, to what we've got going on at the southern border now and the impasse in Congress over making any changes there that can benefit both the citizens of the United States and those who are seeking to emigrate from places where they are in danger, often of their lives. Also of the internal strife related right now to our educational institutions, some of which began to really flare up into collective consciousness over the Gaza Israel-Hamas war, where educational institutions were being accused of anti-Semitism, while others would then accuse it of Islamophobia, and so on and so forth. And finally, the dissolution of this country's avowed philosophy that it exists based, at least in part, on the separation between church and state, meaning, of course, that we separate religion from our politics. But I have to say, too, back on the Jupiter-Neptune energy, that I really find it interesting how very few astrologers, it's kind of like, astrologers want to give their audience what they want. And as I mentioned earlier when I was talking about my discounted natal reading, everybody wants to know what's going to happen tomorrow. But they neglect what's happened in the past. And if you do that, you can't learn, how do we learn? How does Saturn get us to learn? We learn from our mistakes. And to say that you don't make mistakes is to basically acknowledge that you're not really human, right? So if we've all made mistakes, but if we can't look back at them and see what they taught us, then we just go blithely running ahead going, what's going to happen tomorrow? What's going to happen next week? What's going to happen next month? Oh my goodness, And I'm guilty of that too. We all want to know if our kid's going to get married, or when they're going to have a baby, or if they'll buy that house, or, will we buy that car, or, how's the health of our parents and our children and all that kind of stuff, So it's human nature to want to know what's going to happen. But what I'm trying to introduce here is that we should make it more also of our natures, at least on an individual basis, to look back to see where we had a fork in the road and we went left when maybe we should have gone right, which might have been a good thing, or might have been a bad thing, or a negative thing. But then how did we recover from that? Because, we have to be, I guess, really open-minded enough to say that everything happens for a reason. So even if something seems like it's very negative at the time, and a lot of astrologers too, right? We're faced with, if somebody wants to know what's going to happen and you go, oh, Pluto's coming to your sun, or squaring your sun, it's like traditional astrologers will start telling you, somebody's going to die, your mother's going to die, it's opposite your moon, And that may well be true, but where's the benefit in that, right? Let's talk about what your relationship was to your mother and whether it was an intense one, a loving one, and where it is now and where it would be going in the future if something like death is going to occur, which really nobody can say with certainty. I have a whole tirade, which I won't go into, but some astrologers are psychic and some are not. Most of us are very intuitive, but modern astrology does not seek to predict definitively. Rather, we seek to forecast in the same way that one would say, what's the weather forecast today? Oh, it's going to rain. I guess I better take an umbrella. It's a very simple thing. It might not rain. You might be there stuck with your stupid umbrella, like back in the days when I used to commute from Staten Island to Manhattan, you carry the umbrella around, then you go into work, and of course you leave work and you think it stopped raining, but you get outside and it's still raining, but now you can't go back in to get your umbrella, So, as they say, and you'll forgive my French, shit happens, right? You just got to deal with it, and that's part of what the looking ahead to the future is. How are you going to deal with what's happened now or in the future based on what happened in the past? Okay, now, so what I started to say is that I'm kind of like struck by how so many astrologers seem to forget about the Jupiter, Neptune, and Pisces. They forget about the Saturn, Pluto conjunction. They forget, they'll talk a whole ton about Neptune going into Aries and Saturn meeting Neptune there. But then after a while, they'll just stop. And then it'll be like, oh, that didn't exist anymore because it already happened. Whereas the smarter or more forward-thinking astrologers are aware of the cycles and aware of looking at what portion of the cycle we're in vis-a-vis this cycle, that cycle, and the other cycle. And that's what we do with natal charts too, right? So, again, the last time Jupiter and Neptune conjoined in Pisces, it was 1856. I devoted, like I said, a couple of podcasts to talking about the rise of Theosophy, which is a period when people began to acknowledge that they could see or hear or feel spirit, right? Which gave rise to the spiritualist movement, some of which was all about fakery, as is Neptune and Pisces, right? And Jupiter expanding the concept when it's sort of proven to be not entirely based on reality. But also, this was a time period which corresponded, at least in the U.S. Sibley natal chart, with Neptune opposite Neptune and the breaking out of the Civil War, right? But the next conjunction of Jupiter and Neptune won't occur until 2188. So my point, we have a long way to go because we're still, again, in the nascent stages. I'll look in a future podcast at where we are, if we've hit the sextile and when we're going to hit the square, but those will be important times because, Jupiter moves every 12, 13 years into a new sign. And so, it's going to pass by Neptune again. But Neptune by then might be, will be in Aries. So, this was a pretty phenomenal conjunction. But again, if we look at it archetypally, right, we know that Neptune represents dissolution of boundaries. And Jupiter represents, as I said before, law, higher education, foreigners, or read immigration, and religion. Those are the basic things, right? So where have we seen the dissolution of boundaries between these archetypal energies, especially since April 12th of 2020 or leading up to it? Again, I mentioned the current situation at colleges because what's interesting, and Jupiter often, as many of you I'm sure know, represents abundance. And we think of abundance in terms of material wealth, right? So, and I might have mentioned this before too, I don't recall, but some of the major donors, the million and billionaires who donate to Harvard and the Ivy Leagues or to smaller colleges or universities of which they're alma maters, are starting to have too much say in what can go on. This happened at Harvard with the firing of the president, Claudia or Claudine Gay, right? Back when the three presidents, I think it was Penn State, Harvard, and I've now forgotten if it was Yale or Columbia or whatever. But they, they were lambasted in Congress during a congressional hearing about anti-Semitism on their campuses. But meanwhile, they ignored any other kind of prejudice, right? And focused in on that. So any of the wealthy donors that don't agree with what they think is anti-Semitic rhetoric or the allowance of it on campus are now threatening to either withhold money or whatever. And that's part of our capitalist society, right? But anyway, so in other words, it separated donors from wanting to support institutions where they disagree with the politics of the students. And then, of course, the current brouhaha of the southern border, the U.S. border, and conservative complaints that it's too porous versus the liberals who want to protect human rights, which is something I mentioned before. these are things that are all on the table. The recent IVF decision in Alabama by a state Supreme Court judge about the IVF, right? In vitro fertilization is now considered an embryo, and that they consider that's when life begins. So now it's it's banned because I don't even know. Their rationale is just so extreme. But anyway, finally, of course, there's the current dissolving of the American public's respect for the Supreme Court, the highest court in the land, based on the fact that the majority of justices do not reflect the current wishes or the will of the people. And, just the other day, the New York Times published an op-ed discussing how difficult it is to teach basic constitutional law to first-year law students because of the time-honored agreements by law professors of what constitutes the separation by justices of the law from their personal or political leanings, right? So, that, I'm going to read you part of that. I don't know if I have time to read what I want to read. I think I got about 10 minutes here. But this was on February 26th, just a couple days back, as we approached the exact February 28th, conjunction of the Sun, Mercury, and Saturn in Pisces, right? I had said last week that there would be major announcements. I'm going to get into that in a minute. But I want to talk about courts, and I have, as I said, a 9th house sun, an interest in law, and a son who's about to graduate from Georgetown Law School in May. So he went through the constitutional law class as a freshman there. And this was written by Jesse Wegman, who is a member of the New York Times editorial board, who's written about the Supreme Court and national legal affairs since 2013, and is the author of the book, Let the People Pick the President, The Case for Abolishing the Electoral College. And he wrote this op-ed piece, which is titled The Crisis in Teaching Constitutional Law. And I quote, "If you attended law school at any time over the past half-century, your course in constitutional law likely followed a well-worn path. First, you learned the basics, the Supreme Court's power to say what the Constitution means. Then you read and discussed cases that set precedents for different parts of the Constitution, the Commerce Clause, the presidential powers, due process, equal protection, and so on. Finally, you studied how the court balances individual liberties against the government's need to act in the public's interest. It was all based on an underlying premise that has long bound together everyone involved in the project of training the next generation of lawyers. The Supreme Court is a legitimate institution of governance, and the 9 justices, whatever their political backgrounds, care about getting the law right. They are more interested in upholding fundamental democratic principles and, perhaps most important, preserving the court's integrity than in imposing a partisan agenda. The premise," says Wegman, "no longer holds today. Many in the legal world still believed in the old virtues even after Bush versus Gore, the 5-4 ruling that effectively decided the 2000 presidential election on what appeared to many Americans to be partisan grounds. But now the court's hard-right supermajority, installed in recent years through a combination of hypocrisy and sheer partisan muscle, has eviscerated any consensus. Under the pretense of practicing so-called originalism, which claims to interpret the Constitution in line with how it was understood at the nation's founding, these justices have moved quickly to upend decades of established precedent, from political spending to gun laws to voting rights to labor unions to abortion rights to affirmative action to the separation of church and state. All those things I mentioned that have been dissolved with the Jupiter, Neptune, and Pisces conjunction. I didn't mention so much the abortion rights and the labor unions, but still, whatever rationale, he continues, or methodologies the justice apply in a given case, the result virtually always aligns with the policy priorities of the modern Republican Party. And that has made it impossible for many professors to teach in the familiar way. And he goes on to having interviewed several, law professors. I will say, too, that when my son started college, a new podcast came online. Some of you may be familiar with it, called 5-4. And their tagline is, this is a podcast about how much the Supreme Court sucks. So that gives you an idea of how students and some of these professors are now learning and listening to things like these three, I think two of them are lawyers, I'm not sure if all three of them are, but there are three podcasters that go into past cases and ones that are currently, engaged in oral arguments and recent decisions to talk about how erroneous some of these decisions might were in the past or are now, So I want to mention, because as I said last week, we should get ready for some major announcements by the time the Sun, Mercury, and Saturn conjoined in Pisces on February 28th. So the first thing I think is that, in Michigan, we had a large number, I think close to 35,000 people who voted in the Democratic primary as uncommitted, which was a protest vote against Biden's support of Israel. Let's point out, this energy is in Pisces. Pisces is ruled by Neptune, the planet of illusion, confusion, and delusion. Things are very uncertain right now, at least until we start to see more movement into the planet Aries at the spring equinox. But we also learned that Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell announced that he has stepped down as the minority leader in the Senate as of November 2024 after the election, but he will remain a senator. Donald Trump, these are all from February 28th, lost his emergency bid to stay his $464 million judgment in the New York State Attorney General's case. I won't go into those details because they're easy to find. But he also lost the ability, it's under review right now until March 2nd, I think, that he wants to put up he says he's worth $2 billion plus, but he can't post all $464 million in a bond while he appeals the case, along with his appeal of the E. Jean Carroll case, right? So he can only put down $100 million. And so the judge has said, nope, sorry, I'll give you until March 2nd, to figure it out, and then whatever. On February 28th, Hunter Biden testified in a private hearing by the House Impeachment Committee, right? Another thing where we spoke last week about the fact that Alexander Smirnov, which I forgot to mention after the fact, I thought it was so amusing because the Sun moved into Pisces, right, on the 18th of February, and then last week, let me just double check. I think Mercury moved into Pisces, right, at the right before the full moon, right, and so the Virgo full moon telling the Sun and Mercury and Saturn, like, get your stuff together because all of what you're saying has no basis in reality, and so Smirnov, I was like, oh, that's the name of the vodka. Right, for years, right? When you went into a bar or when you went into a liquor store, it was like Smirnoff. So that's the name of this guy who turned out to be lying, right? You gotta laugh, right? Also, Emmanuel Macron announced, and I think this was probably, I'm not sure if this was misconstrued or what, but he appeared to announce his willingness to put boots on the ground in Ukraine, because he said Europe could no longer count on the U.S. to continue to fund Ukraine because of all the confusion, the chaos, etc., of what's going on in the Congress currently. Of course, we have, and today I believe, right before I started recording, because I had to record this is Thursday afternoon, February 29th. My brother is in the hospital. He had a stroke last week, and so my time is limited, and I'm recording this a little bit earlier than I usually do because, again, as a news hound, I like to hang out and to the last possible moment find out exactly what's going on up to the minute. So the House was voting on a continuing resolution to ward off the partial shutdown of the government by noon on Saturday, March 2nd, if they didn't pass something by like midnight tonight, March 1st. Well, now I'm speaking from different date, but you know what I'm saying. So Janet Yellen, with the U.S. financial, I can't remember offhand she's not the Fed chair, that's Jerome Powell, but she's the Secretary of Treasury. She made a statement about the possibility of taking the $300 billion in frozen Russian assets and funds, most of them in Switzerland and other banks in the EU. There's only $5 billion of that money in U.S. banks, but the discussion is coming up again about whether or not different countries, as like NATO countries, unified countries, can take some of that frozen money and apply it towards Ukraine. Whether the application of those funds go towards arming Ukraine or, the military, whether it goes to rebuilding Ukraine after the fact, those are options that are reportedly on the table and continue to be discussed. Finally, the Supreme Court, announced that it's going to hear the case involving whether Trump is immune from prosecution, because presidents are immune from prosecution, he claims, even when they're no longer president, and that would be on the charges of plotting to overturn the 2020 election. Oral arguments for that Supreme Court review are scheduled for April 22nd, which April 20th is the Jupiter-Uranus conjunction, so we'll keep an eye on that. And the federal Jack Smith case being presided over by Judge Chutkin, that trial date remains frozen until the Supreme Court decision on this matter, which is likely no later than the end of June, but still delay. We also had, on the day of the Saturn-Sun-Mercury conjunction in Pisces, a judge ordering Trump removed from the Illinois primary ballot. How do you like that? And that there's many states, there's like 30 states or something that are trying to get him off the ballot right now. So the Supreme Court decision, which hasn't come down yet either, about the Colorado case, is everyone's waiting for that. And then finally, I mentioned the Alabama IVF BS, right? And that there was a piece on the 28th in the New York Times titled, "Senate Republican Blocks Bill to Protect IVF Treatment." They are trying in Alabama to pass legislation. I don't know what the latest is on that. By tomorrow, there may be new stories, or new news, but they're trying to undo what the judge did. But this quick little portion of this article says Republicans, many of whom have said they support access to the treatment, meaning in vitro fertilization, have argued that it should be left to states to ensure its legality after an Alabama court ruled that frozen embryos were children. A Republican senator on Wednesday blocked quick passage of a bill that would establish federal protections for in vitro fertilization and other fertility treatments in the wake of a ruling by the Alabama Supreme Court that frozen embryos should be considered children. Okay, that's redundant. I would have edited that a little, but regardless, Senator Cindy Hyde-Smith, Republican of Mississippi, objected to approval of the measure, which would establish a federal right protecting access to IVF and fertility treatments, scuttling its chances for now. Senator Tammy Duckworth, Democrat of Illinois, sought to pass the bill on Wednesday under a procedure that allows only one senator to object and stop it in its tracks, effectively daring Republicans to oppose it and highlighting divisions within the GOP on how to handle the issue. So clearly, we got a lot of stuff that's up in the air. I would also go into, Biden's statement, which I think I mentioned last week. As we're approaching, like I said, the third quarter square of the monthly lunar cycle, which will be the square on March 3rd of the Sagittarius moon to the Pisces sun. Sagittarius, of course, being all of those issues related, archetypally to the Jupiter-ruled Sagittarius archetype. But for now, I'm going to have to leave it at that. And I want to thank everyone again for joining me today. And to say I hope you found the information presented here helpful. Sorry if I've been rushing through it, but it's just been a hectic week and I got places to go. But anyway, I hope you found the information presented here helpful as you continue your karmic evolution in this lifetime. Please be sure to join me next week on March 8th for another podcast. Until then, may your journey be filled with karmic healing and the joy of greater consciousness. Namaste.
Long ago, before this day's confusion did begin, Throughout the stars did we go wandering. Distance was no barrier, and time it had no hope. Free to come and free to go. Free to come and free to go. Open up the book.